Live from Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Joe Mathieu.
The search for the next Fed chair reaches into the private sector. Welcome to the Wednesday edition of Balance of Power here on Bloomberg TV and radio as President Trump reacts to new names on the growing list, including his own, by the way, only hours after Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent weighed in right here on Bloomberg TV and radio. We're going to get into this straight ahead with Bloomberg's Michael McKee with insights later this hour from Republican Congressman Troy Downing of Montana, serves on the Financial Services Committee. We'll get into Friday's meeting as well, a high-stakes session one-on-one between President Trump and Vladimir Putin coming up. Jennifer Kavanagh at the military analyst at Defense Priorities will be with us here as well. And it's all after a look at Wall Street. Let's update the Wednesday trade right now with Charlie Pellet in New York. He's got the latest on the markets.
All right. Thank you very much, Joe Mathieu. Indeed, we've got NASDAQ in the red right now, down 19, retreating from a record, down 0.1%. S&P 500 index, yes, still at a record, but little change right now. The S&P 500 index up 2. That is a gain of under 0.1%. Emphasis on little change there. Dow Industrials up 300 even, now up by about 0.7%. Traders keep piling into bets that the Fed will be cutting rates soon. Bond yields sinking as stocks hold near records. We've got the 10-year at 4.23%, the 2-year 3.68%. Spot gold up $10 the ounce, 33.58, up 0.3%. West Texas Intermediate crude down 1.4% with a 62 handle at 62.27 on WTI, and Bitcoin at 121,518 on Bitcoin, up now by 1.1%. We are awaiting the start of trading for Bullish, the crypto exchange, indicated now to open at $89 to $90. Keep raising that number. We are looking at the firm that is backed by Peter Thiel. Initially, the IPO price was $37 a share, but again, indications to open $89 to $90. The company announced back in 2021 that it was planning to go public with a special purpose acquisition company. Bullish, by the way, counts former NYSE President Tom Farley as its CEO. Again, recapping here, S&P 500 index up 4, gain there of 0.1%. Just getting word that Bullish has now opened by 151% as we watch that stock. BLSH on the ticker. Again, Bullish has started trading right now at $94 a share, up by 156%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, bringing us the breaking word. As always, Charlie, thank you so much. Bullish off and running. BLSH on your terminal. This is the first minute of trading that's underway right now. Thank you for being with us here on the Wednesday edition, the early edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington, now up 175% at almost $103 a share. Bullish opening at $90, remembering the IPO price was $37 a share. So this is a pretty remarkable move right off the top here. Another crypto name here, Bullish, a crypto exchange and news provider, as they're calling it, with an enormous amount of demand here. This had initially been a roughly $20 million share offer with an expected price of as low as $28. It grew to 30 million shares, and you've seen what's happened to the price here. 30 million shares set to raise about $1 billion at 37, and this thing is absolutely off and running. We're going to be talking with Bloomberg's Mike Regan when he gets to the studio here, because I'm guessing that his hair is blown back a little bit by this. This is the company that we've been talking about quite a bit lately that's had financial backing from Peter Thiel, as Charlie Pellet just mentioned. BlackRock and Cathie Wood's ARK Investment Management have shown big interest in this name as Bullish begins trading right now, following the incredible demand that we saw, for instance, for Circle, the stablecoin issuer, which saw its IPO take off in June. We also saw a very successful IPO from CoreWeave getting into the AI space, although that's been a bit lower today following CoreWeave's quarterly earnings here. Looking back to the tape just to watch this thing take off a little bit here, it looks like we've got a trading halt in Bullish. Are you seeing that as well, James? Trading halt at $102.44. This is something that's just happening only a couple of moments into trading here. So we're going to be talking a lot more about this with Mike Regan. Pretty remarkable to see the new issues market open up the way that it has over the past couple of months. And it brings us back to the whole conversation here in Washington at the beginning of the Trump term about so-called animal spirits. And just a day after watching Goldman Sachs hit an all-time high, it reminds us of how important this component of the market was that lay dormant for so many years following COVID and so on. If you're watching your terminal right now, BLSH with a trading halt, and Bloomberg's Mike Regan is with us from World Headquarters in New York. What do you make of this most recent news here? We got off for about a minute, Mike, and got halted at just over $102.
Yeah, pretty amazing, Joe. I mean, considering that, this IPO priced at $37, so almost tripling here from that offering price on the first print. It is kind of to be expected that there, no pun intended, a lot of bullishness for these crypto IPOs. I mean, we saw Circle, the stablecoin operator earlier in the year, jumping about 169% on its first day. Figma, not a crypto play, but more of an AI play. Its IPO, it was up 250% on its first day. So clearly, the market sentiment right now is just so risk on for the entire market, and that is really just getting put through a magnifying glass for these IPOs, especially in these sort of buzzy of the moment industries like crypto and AI. So pretty remarkable opening for sure.
Well, that is for sure. I was just mentioning Goldman Sachs while you were walking in the studio, Mike Regan, hitting an all-time high on the 12th of August with the idea of new issues finally coming back to life. How real are the animal spirits in this market?
They're tremendous. I mean, when you look at this, more than a 30% rally from the April lows in the S&P 500, even better for the NASDAQ. Still waiting for the Dow to hit that record. But, especially quite a time to price an IPO and start trading after the CPI number this week really sort of let everybody exhale a little bit and get back to thinking that we'll get maybe 2 interest rates, maybe even more interest rate cuts by the Fed this year because that CPI, it was still a little hot, but not as hot as people maybe in their worst case scenario were worried about. And with that jobs report we saw for July, it's kind of all combining for this really major risk appetite in the stock market. You still have the AI theme really propelling the mega caps, and it's sort of a situation where it's lifting all boats now when you add in this prospects potentially for some interest rate cuts from the Fed.
Well, what does that mean for the pipeline, though? I mean, we've had a couple of really successful IPOs this season. What else could be coming? Who's Goldman Sachs meeting with right now?
Well, we're getting ready for MIAX this week. That's the Miami Options Exchange. That's the next one sort of, in the pipeline to price this week. I'm not sure if we'll see the exact amount of optimism, given that is more of a traditional exchange. They do have a crypto element to it. They bought the old derivatives exchange from FTX. So that might get a little bit more excitement around that name. We'll have to see. Besides that, and here Bullish has just started trading again, so back up to 105 now. So
there we go.
Yeah, stand by for another trading pause, volatility pause, possibly. But
yeah, entirely possible. Look at this; it's up 195% here. We're going to hit $110 in a minute, Mike. This thing just keeps on rolling. We could see trading halts throughout the session. Then, is your point?
I think so. Yeah, quite possible. But certainly, this is a stock in the sweet spot for what this sort of risk appetite in the market is looking for this year. With President Trump embracing crypto, Bullish, not a real well-known exchange in the U.S. It does own the CoinDesk crypto news site, which it's probably best known for in the U.S. But I think there's a lot of optimism that, its prospects in the U.S. could be improving under the much looser and very hands-off regulatory regime under President Trump for the crypto industry.
Boy, what a move. Now up 205%. Mike Regan, thank you so much. We'll get back to Mike a little later, maybe this hour, if the gains keep coming here. Now, gosh, at $107 here. Bullish off and running on Wall Street. Thank you, Mike. At World Headquarters in New York, I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington, where we're balancing a lot of names today. Not just names of new issues, but names of candidates for the new Fed chair. Interesting, as the list keeps getting longer. The president was asked about this a short time ago by our very own Josh Wingrove when he was at the Kennedy Center talking about the likes of Kiss and Sylvester Stallone. He did get to this matter, suggesting that if I understood him correctly, when you get a short list, people start asking a lot of questions and think they know what's going on. And maybe there's a strategy here to open the conversation. So let's do that right now with Bloomberg's Michael McKee. He's with us live from New York with some pretty familiar names here. Mike, this is kind of like a party at your house. Rick Reeder, David Zervos, Larry Lindsay. On top of the names that we've heard, of course, the Christopher Wallers, Mickey Bowmans of the world, Kevin Warsh, Kevin Hassett. Is the White House trying to just keep us talking and looking in a different direction, or is the search actually widening?
That's a very good question. I have no idea, because Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, who's nominally in charge of this process, came on Bloomberg Surveillance this morning, and he said, we're going to have 10 or 11 candidates. If you count up the names so far, you got 11. And the president came out at the Kennedy Center and said, I'm down to 3 or 4, which is something he's been saying for quite some time. Now, I realize that you told me there would be no math on this program, but let's just say it's kind of hard to know here exactly what's going on. I was talking with somebody.
Well, it sounds like you had the first 3 or 4 names we've been talking about, and then maybe somebody in the White House communications office said, give them another handful to confuse Joe and Michael.
We've all had that sort of HR experience, and you can't use the term anymore under the Trump administration. You can't say DEI, but perhaps it's a little bit of Bessent's effort to do that. We really don't know, because we don't know how seriously to take any of these people. We take the Kevins, who've been talked about forever, Hassett and Warsh, and Chris Waller's been talked about forever. He was talked up by the Treasury Department a week and a half ago as a top candidate, and he's obviously well known. But beyond that, these are all people who just keep getting added to the list, and some of them you don't think are really serious. Philip Jefferson, he doesn't bring anything to the Trump table, put it that way. He's a well-respected economist, Fed vice chair, but he's not an uber dove, and he's not somebody who wants to shake up the Fed. So I'm not sure what they're talking about there. And it's kind of hard to know why you go back to Larry Lindsay, who was a Fed governor in the 1990s. He was actually, Joe, the first Fed official I ever interviewed when I came on the beat. But he's been around for a very long time. David Zervos, if you know David, he doesn't fit the image, shall we say, of a Fed chair. Rick Reeder is a good name, but I have no idea if he'd be interested in anything like that.
Right. Well, I'm sure they'd all take a pretty good pay cut with this job. Did I see that the name Donald J. Trump was on the list?
I have not seen that. It was floated by some in the administration, but
yes, it was.
The problem is the Federal Reserve Act says that that Fed governors cannot have any other job. So if the president would like to give up being president, he could name himself Fed chair.
Fascinating. You mentioned Scott Bessent. Boy, was that something. Every time he sits down on Bloomberg, we learn a lot. And he started talking, of course, about interest rates with the idea of inflation maybe warming up, if not heating up, following that CPI yesterday. And he still wants big cuts, maybe bigger than some would have expected. Michael McKee, here's what he said earlier today on Bloomberg.
We should probably be 150, 175 basis points lower. So, I think the committee needs to step back. I think probably one of the most politicized governors just went off the board.
Presumably referring to Kugler. Talking to Anne Marie and John there, why should we be at least 150 basis points lower, Mike?
Because the president would like that.
Okay.
That's the argument. Now, at some point, the Fed will lower rates to what they would consider neutral, which is neither holding back or stimulating the economy. But right now, with inflation above 3%, they're not going to do that. They want to lean against inflation, and that would mitigate against any kind of cut like that. Now, the Fed might cut rates in September, but if they do, it's going to be 25 basis points. It's not going to be 175. Now, over the course of the next year through 2026, you could get there if the economy keeps improving or gets really bad, whichever one. But right now, that's kind of out of bounds. There are 7 models that economists and central bankers use to try to figure out what the interest rate should be, and none of them basically are under 4% at this point.
Always great to spend time with you, Michael. Mr. McKee, live from World Headquarters in New York, Bloomberg's international economics and policy correspondent. Always fun to play the name game. At some point, we'll get to the end of this road here with our eyes not only on what's happening with regard to the Fed, but Scott Bessent talked about a lot more, including Russia's war against Ukraine and the looming meeting, Friday's meeting, one-on-one between President Trump and Vladimir Putin. We just had a bunch of headlines just across the terminal a couple of moments ago, following President Trump's conversation with European leaders that included Volodymyr Zelenskiy. Zelenskiy appeared after that telephone meeting with the Chancellor of Germany and made some news, saying that it was a productive conversation with President Trump and European leaders, coordinating positions ahead of the meeting. They're trying to get on the same page here. They discussed possible formats for future talks and meetings, and that's important. President Trump telling reporters today at the Kennedy Center that, in fact, the second meeting would likely be more productive, that this first meeting, as we heard yesterday from the White House, was more about a feeling out session to get a sense of what progress could be made as opposed to landing a peace deal in this meeting itself. Zelenskiy saying that President Trump proposed a call after Alaska. Scott Bessent did talk about all of this with Anne Marie and John Farrow earlier on Bloomberg Surveillance. Let's listen to the Treasury Secretary.
The president has been thinking about this a long time. He believes, as do I, that this war never would have started if he had been president, and he is committed to ending the bloodshed, but not at any cost. Not at any cost. I think everyone has been frustrated with President Putin. We expected that he would come to the table in a more fulsome way. It looks like he may be ready to negotiate, and we've put secondary tariffs on the Indians for buying Russian oil, and I could see if things don't go well, then sanctions or secondary tariffs could go up.
What about China? They're the main purchasers of Russian crude.
Again, I'm not going to get ahead of the president, but the president is the best at creating leverage for himself, and he will make it clear to President Putin that all options are on the table.
So sanctions can go up, or they can also be loosened?
Sanctions can go up, they can be loosened, they can have a definitive life, they can go on indefinitely. You know, there's this Russian shadow fleet of ships around the world that I think we could crack down on them. But Anne Marie and Jonathan, the one message I would leave you with, it's that President Trump is meeting with President Putin, and the Europeans are in the wings carping about how he should do it, what he should do it. But the Europeans need to join us in these sanctions. The Europeans need to be willing to put on these secondary sanctions. I was at the G7 meeting in Canada with President Trump, and the Europeans kept talking about Senator Graham's bill to do the secondary tariffs. Yeah. And I looked at all the leaders around the table and I said, is everyone at this table willing to put a 200% secondary tariff on China? And you know what? Everybody wanted to see what kind of shoes they were wearing.
As opposed to raising their hands. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent with Jonathan Farrow and Anne Marie Hordern on Bloomberg Surveillance earlier this morning, which brings us to our conversation with Jennifer Kavanagh. He doesn't want to get ahead of the president, but we're going to try to get ahead of this meeting to understand exactly what might come from it. Senior Fellow, Director of Military Analysis at Defense Priorities and co-author of Truth Decay, an initial exploration of the diminishing role of facts and analysis in American public life. Jennifer, welcome back. It's great to see you. From your view at defense priorities, I'm wondering what you're expecting here, having just heard the Treasury Secretary speak about secondary sanctions. What's more likely, those sanctions to be put into effect or a peace deal to emerge from this meeting?
I think neither, actually. I think the most likely outcome here is that President Putin and President Trump spend the meeting feeling each other out, getting a sense of where each side's red lines lie. I think that the United States can learn a lot in this meeting from where Putin might be flexible in terms of making compromises. And my hope is that they come out with, number one, a plan to keep talking at high levels between Trump, Putin, and hopefully at some point Zelenskiy, as well as a concrete plan to have working level negotiations to start to hash out some of the details that will have to be addressed before any ceasefire or lasting settlement. So that's what I see as a really good outcome. And that's neither, punishing sanctions or an end to the war.
Well, maybe it is, in fact, some half measure. The president apparently said on this call today that he hopes to bring a ceasefire from this meeting. Could a ceasefire with Vladimir Putin be trusted?
Well, it depends what the terms of the ceasefire are and what the deal looks like. I think a ceasefire, a full ceasefire coming out of this meeting would be unlikely simply because Zelenskiy isn't there to participate in the discussion. It's possible that they might agree to some sort of framework deal, like that Putin agrees in principle to a ceasefire on the condition that other issues are worked out, including territorial issues, as well as issues about Western assistance and other types of conditions that the Russians have already laid out and have stuck to throughout the war. It's also possible you might see a partial ceasefire. For example, some people have floated the idea of an air ceasefire, which would limit airstrikes between the two sides, and then the continued fighting would be on the ground. And that would help both sides. Russia has experienced some costs from Ukrainian drone and missile strikes on their oil facilities. And Ukraine is certainly suffering under Russian attacks on civilian infrastructure and cities.
We finally got some details on this meeting, as I'm sure you've seen. It will be in Anchorage at the Elmendorf-Richardson Joint Base. What kind of facilities should be provided here? Do these two meet in a hangar? I keep asking the same question. I'm just wondering what the optics will be. And the idea of Vladimir Putin on a U.S. military base, pretty striking at this particular moment, isn't it?
Yeah, I agree. And I had the same sort of thought. I mean, military bases are typically pretty Spartan and not what you normally see for these high level meetings. However, it is also true that, at the commanding general level, there are usually well adorned conference rooms that are used for these types of high level meetings, even among military leaders. So I'm sure that they'll be using, one of these types of more high level and rooms. But I think it is interesting that they chose the military base. Obviously, the choice of Alaska itself is an interesting one. So we'll see what it looks like.
Is this meeting flawed in its initial concept in that it's one-on-one? President talked about maybe a trilateral the second time around, but the idea of President Zelenskiy waiting by the phone to hear what happened is also curious.
Well, I think that this meeting is really, as President Trump himself has said, and his staff has made clear, a chance for listening and understanding. And the United States and Russia have a bilateral relationship that is quite tense and that exists outside of what's happening in Ukraine. And I do think it's important that the two leaders meet on a at the bilateral level and try to work out some of these issues as well. I think that while the focus will be on Ukraine, it's hard to imagine that some of the bilateral issues between the two nations won't come up. And really, we see here that Zelenskiy has made clear he's ready for a ceasefire on acceptable terms, and he's willing to at least have negotiations and discussions. We have seen Putin has been much less willing to end this war. So if Putin is the party right now that is harder to bring to the table, it makes sense to have a one-on-one meeting and try to figure out what's required to change that. This is also the format that I think Trump is very comfortable in, these bilateral meetings with other world leaders. And so that that's something that he gravitates towards. But he hasn't shown in past phone calls and interactions with Putin over the past 6 or 7 months, he hasn't given any part of Ukraine away. He hasn't sacrificed Ukraine's security or its sovereignty. So I think the idea that he's ready to serve Ukraine on a plate doesn't match up with what we've seen in the recent past.
Well, what do you make of the European counteroffer, if I can call it that? A counteroffer to reports that the lines essentially would be frozen in place. I know the president's talked about land swap, and we don't really have a sense of exactly what that means, but Vladimir Putin wants the Donbas and he wants Crimea. The European leaders on that phone call have a different idea. 1 inch for 1 inch. And this doesn't sound like something that Vladimir Putin is ready to talk about, but any retreat of Ukrainian forces from Ukrainian-controlled territory would be matched inch for inch by Russia's withdrawal from occupied Ukrainian territory. Is there a world in which that could happen?
Well, I mean, it's not out of the question. It just the question is, what are the other terms of the ceasefire, and what do those land swaps look like? I mean, in any sort of ceasefire, there are adjustments to the line. So even if the line is frozen where the front line currently is, and that becomes the new de facto border, it would be expected that there would be adjustments to that line to make sure that cities are on one side or the other, to make sure that geographic features, are taken into account. So I think that this idea of land swaps, we may not be talking about huge swaths of territory. And Russia has put forward a set of conditions. One set of conditions is this Ukrainian withdrawal from territory that it currently controls. But there's another set of conditions, another ceasefire option that Putin has put on the table, and that is freezing the conflict along the current front line. But then it comes with other conditions, including things like freezing of Western security assistance aid, limits or demobilization, which would shrink the size of Ukraine's military. So Putin has suggested some flexibility in setting out a range of terms. So we shouldn't fixate only on territory here. It's not the only issue that's at stake.
All right. Really interesting, and appreciate your helping us get ready for this important meeting. Jennifer Kavanagh, thank you so much. The insights from Defense Priorities. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington, and we want to assemble our political panel for their take on all of this. This is a remarkable political moment, and you could argue the most important meeting of Donald Trump's presidency in either turn, for that matter. Lisa Camooso Miller is here, Republican strategist, former communications director at the RNC, and host of the Friday Reporter podcast, along with Bloomberg Politics contributor Adam Hodge, Democratic strategist, managing director at Pulpit International. Adam, I'm going to start with you just on the nuts and bolts here. What do you make of the venue? There were questions about whether the U.S. should be a host country. Now we're going to have a U.S. military based as the venue for Vladimir Putin, a pariah on the international stage, and a man, in fact, who has an international warrant out for his arrest. How should the optics be cared for here? And when we talk about a one-on-one meeting, who's actually in the room?
Well, I think taking a step back to the president's first term, when he had his previous bilateral meeting with President Putin, shouldn't give us a whole lot of confidence that America's interests will be front and center. I think to your question about the optics, hosting the Russian president at a U.S. base sends a terrible signal to our allies, to our partners across Europe, to the Ukrainians, that we would meet and host President Putin on U.S. soil after what he's done to attack our democracy, to attack our allies and partners, and to unsettle democracies across the region. So it sends a terrible signal. I'm not surprised that President Trump, doesn't want to, doesn't really care about what that may mean from the chattering class or folks on cable TV. But I think it really will send a real red flag to our allies and partners in Europe, and that really matters globally.
Lisa, what's your thought on this? They're both going to meet at some point during the day on Friday at Elmendorf-Richardson Joint Base in Anchorage. You don't have a lot of options in Anchorage, by the way, to find venue for these two. Who should be in the room and who will be in the room?
Well, Joe, I think Adam makes a really good point, and it's hard to know who'll be in the room. The truth of it is that the message and the visuals and all of the optics of this particular conversation are definitely one that are going to be very difficult. So I suspect that the president will be surrounded by his top leaders, and I suspect the same for Vladimir Putin. He'll be surrounded by his leadership, and this will be one that I think, regardless of how it goes, will be one that will have to be messaged very carefully, and something that I think that overall, while historic, also not incredibly encouraging, because I suspect that regardless of what happens in this meeting, Vladimir Putin is going to do exactly what Vladimir Putin wants to do. And it's been shown over and over again as the president has shared messages about how he thinks things are going to happen and what's going to happen in Ukraine, and then those change. I think the same will probably be true of this as well. I think Vladimir Putin will use it as a tool and a pawn, really, in how he messages, how he works with the White House and how he works with this administration.
Gaming expectations, always a big part of this, Adam. The White House had been tamping down expectations the last couple of days, saying, hey, this isn't about a peace deal here. This is a feeling out session. The president wants to know where Putin's head is. And it seems like we have a pretty good sense of where his head is. But that does not sound like what we're hearing from this call today between Trump, European leaders, and President Zelenskiy of Ukraine, in which Donald Trump said his goal is to arrive at a ceasefire on Friday. Is that in the realm of possibility?
I have a hard time believing that Ukraine, after all they've been through, will agree to a ceasefire, given what they've seen on the front lines and what has happened across Kyiv. I mean, let's not forget, Donald Trump has multiple times told Putin to stop firing missiles into Ukraine, said he had a great call with him, and then less than 5-6 hours later, the missiles were launched again. People were killed in Ukraine. So I'd keep my powder a little dry on any expectations about it, grand breakthroughs, because Vladimir Putin has not shown any willingness to abide by whether it's norms or just to respect Ukraine's territorial sovereignty. So my expectations are as low as they can get, unfortunately.
Well, how about you, Lisa? What should we be looking for when these two men emerge from the meeting? We expect Donald Trump will hold some kind of a news conference or make an announcement to reporters. What will he have to say?
Well, the president likes to demonstrate wins, and so I suspect that that's precisely what we'll hear from him. But to Adam's point, I also think we need to pay very close attention to the movements that happen out of Russia beyond that conversation to see whether or not there is any progress that has been made. Also to the fact that the president is using this as an opportunity and will continue to use this as an opportunity to demonstrate that he's willing to have hard conversations that Joe Biden and other presidents before him were not willing to have. I'm not so sure that matters if from that meeting nothing happens from there. But I think that, we've seen this president over and over again take a victory lap before the victory is ready to be celebrated. And I suspect that that'll be exactly what happens after this meeting occurs.
He's going to speak with European leaders afterward as well. And apparently he's going to do an interview, we understand. Adam, the rollout here is curious. It's a day trip to Alaska, so they're not going to be together, presumably, for all that long. Will you trust the readout from each side? Because they may not agree, as we've seen in the past, unless they hold a bilateral news conference, which I think after last time around, the White House would prefer not to do.
I mean, you're right there. I think given what happened the last time, President Trump, suffered from that press conference. It still haunts him to this day. But I think what you're seeing in this being a potentially one-on-one meeting without any other staff or people in the room for the course of that meeting seems like an outgrowth of what happened during the president's first term. We know that he was deeply suspicious of the professional staff listening in on his foreign leader calls. We know they've taken steps from the beginning of this administration to shield any insight from calls within the National Security Council. And I think it leaves them at a detriment. I think it leaves the rest of the U.S. government at a detriment to have that sort of closed cloak around foreign leader conversations, because it is important for the entire government to understand exactly what was discussed and how they all then take marching orders and go from there if they all have a sense of how the meeting unfolded. So there's a real risk there And I wish I had more confidence. If they end up in a ceasefire, great. We'll give him all the credit he deserves. But I'm deeply skeptical.
Well, you wonder who gets to the microphones first. Sometimes that's the way these things go on the ground. You both know about this, having run media operations like this, remembering Scott Bessent couldn't get to reporters before the Chinese did following the trade talks most recently. So what's it going to be, Lisa? A listening exercise, as Caroline Leavitt called it yesterday, or a peace negotiation?
Boy, I mean, I think it'll probably be a listening exercise. I think the way that the perception behind the way that Vladimir Putin views this relationship and the relationship that Donald Trump holds out as his connection with the Russian leader are two very, very different things. And I think, it really feels like Vladimir Putin has the upper hand here, and Donald Trump wants to make that not look the way that it is. But to me, it seems like Putin is using Trump as a pawn in this bigger game that he's playing with the globe. And so while it's a listening session, I suspect, too, as you mentioned earlier, that this is them setting the groundwork and setting really the tone for what will be just another meeting that has almost no outcome.
We're going to have special coverage here no matter what happens on Friday. Adam, I'm sorry we're out of time against a hard break here, but we really appreciate the insights. Bloomberg Politics contributor Adam Hodge, Bully Pulpit International, and Lisa Camooso Miller, former RNC communications director. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington. We'll have much more ahead as we keep our eyes on Bullish, back open, up 149%. This is Bloomberg. We're playing the name game here. We've got several new names on the not-so-short list for Fed. And when you look at these names, they're reaching into the private sector in some cases here. It's kind of like a cookout at Charlie Pellet's house. Rick Reeder, David Zervos, Larry Lindsay. On top of all the names that we had heard before, yes, Christopher Waller, the Kevins, Hassett, and Warsh. I see Mickey Bowman, Philip Jefferson, Mark Summerlin, and James Bullard all on this list, keeping the tongues wagging up and down the Amtrak corridor. By the way, kicking off that conversation today in the markets, the whole market stopped at 7:30 to listen to Scott Bessent in a fascinating conversation with my colleagues on Bloomberg Surveillance, Jonathan Ferro and Anne-Marie Hordern, speaking not only about the next Fed chair, but the man who was just announced only hours after he was on this broadcast, Stephen Myron, the White House chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, to fill on a temporary basis. Seems to be the plan here. The chair left vacant by Governor Kugler. The big question right now, can they get him confirmed in time for the next Fed meeting? Here's Scott Bessent from earlier today on Bloomberg.
The president has great sway with Leader Thune. Leader Thune's been a great partner during the tax deal, and I think that he would like to see Stephen, who I've known for a long time, get on there as soon as possible. So I'm hopeful about the September meeting. And Jonathan, the president's concerned about the building and those massive cost overrun, which just tell you that there is no accountability at that organization. There's no oversight in terms of the spending, but the president and I are both concerned about the foundations of the Fed. The foundations of the Fed, and how did this happen, and why did it happen, and how did the leadership let it happen?
When it comes to Director Myron, do you expect him to stay on past the January term that expires from Kugler's seat?
I wouldn't expect that.
So who are some names you're thinking of the Kugler seat? Because everyone has been focused on who is going to fill the chairmanship role. Who are you thinking to fill that extra seat?
Well, Anne-Marie, we're working on the big list right now. I think there are going to be a couple more names revealed today. They're going to be private sector names. So we had a series or a list of current Fed members. We're going to have some private sector, very well respected,
like who?
Very well respected people, and then we will get to the second seat.
Can you give us some names, a little bit of a tease? Maybe people that have been on this program?
Well, I just did tease, telling you there would be some private sector names.
Okay, when it comes to the Fed chair, though, can you give us a sense of how many names you're actually thinking about?
Well, I'm going to interview, I'm going to cast a wide net. 10, 11 people, and then there'll be a group of us who are meeting with them, and we want to talk about monetary policy. We want to talk about regulatory policy, which is very, very important because the Fed stepped, I think, big-footed the other regulators. The Fed's one of 3 regulators, Federal Reserve, OCC, and FDIC. And I think that they need to understand that they are one of 3. And then the third is the institution itself, which I think is what President Trump has been focused on quite a bit, too.
After you do this process, how many names are going to give to the president, and when does he start those in-person interviews?
Yeah, we don't have a timeline. By putting Stephen Myron in, that gives us more time. And again, I want to cast a wide net. The president's very open-minded. Before he chose Jay Powell, Janet Yellen was interviewed. John Taylor was interviewed. 2 of them couldn't be more different. So they were under consideration.
Fascinating. Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, earlier today on Bloomberg surveillance, having a little trouble with the math. 10 to 11 names going to the president. But the president said a short time ago at the Kennedy Center when asked by Bloomberg's Josh Wingrove that, in fact, the search was down to 3 or 4 Fed chair picks. You saw the headline cross the terminal. It says he will name a Fed chair a little bit early, which is interesting considering the timeline we're talking about here for Stephen Myron. Let's get into all of this with Troy Downing. What a pleasure to have the Republican congressman from Montana's 2nd District in the House. He's at World Headquarters in New York and joins us live from the Fishbowl. It's great to see you, Congressman. Welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. How do you feel about this idea of maybe reaching into the private sector for the next Fed chair?
I think we need more of that. I think we need more private sector understanding and experience to solve problems in government. I think this administration has identified that. I think this administration has been correct on a lot of these picks, and it brings a new perspective. And I think we need that in having somebody that has been in, I'm going to say, the real world and not, strictly as, a regulator or a political person. I think that's powerful. I mean, my background, I came from the private sector, and then I was a regulator, and now I'm a lawmaker. So I bring that experience from those different parts into what I do. And I think it's, I'm excited about this process, and I'm excited about seeing who makes it through this confirmation process.
Well, it's interesting. Some of the names that had been floated, when the president says 3 to 4, I'm assuming 2 of them are the Kevins. Hassett, Warsh, would you be happy with a Fed run by some of the names on the so-called short list right now?
Yeah, I think it'll be great. Obviously, we need to go through the process, and the president is being very thoughtful about this. His team is being very thoughtful. And then, the Senate, I'm sure, is going to, ask all the right questions to make sure that we're comfortable in that position to make that decision. But I would be very happy going through that process. I think this is a normal, necessary process, and we're going to get a big upgrade in that position.
Well, your view is important here as a member of the House Financial Services Committee.
Yes.
This list keeps growing. You're going to throw your hat in?
Oh, no, not for me. I've got work to do, and I'm excited about the work we are doing on financial services. But I am excited about seeing some change there and seeing what comes.
Jay Powell was a private sector guy at one time, as Ed Duffner reminds me.
There you go.
Look, I know you were not only in the private sector before, you were also in the military. You joined the Air Force following 9/11. You twice deployed to Afghanistan, and I think that your view on what's about to unfold on Friday is important to our viewers and listeners. Should Vladimir Putin be setting foot on a U.S. airbase in Alaska?
I'm not part of that decision process. I think it's obviously unusual, but I've got to give kudos to the president. The president, and you keep hearing the art of the deal, and the president knows how to get things done. And if this is the correct venue in him doing that process, I'm very supportive. We need to see this stop. We need to see this come to an end. We need to make sure that the killing, that the war stops, and that we can see peace there. And if this is the process that the president believes is appropriate, I'm supportive of that, and I'm really hopeful to see this come to an end, because it's just atrocious what we've seen happening in this now drawn out war, and we need to see it come to an end. And I really do believe that Donald Trump is the person who can bring this to a good conclusion.
As we always see before events like this, there's a gaming of expectations. I don't know what yours are here, if it's a ceasefire or just kind of an agreement to meet again, as we've been hearing from the White House. But I wonder your thoughts on secondary sanctions. They appear to be slowed down a bit and to make room for these talks to take place. But should countries buying Russian oil be punished for it if this goes nowhere?
You know, I think that sanctions are a powerful tool, and I think we need to, personally keep our foot on the throttle on this. There's a bill that I have out there right now to stop Russian market manipulation in critical minerals. We produce platinum and palladium in my district, the only place in the United States of America. And so we've got the Stop Russian Manipulation Act to make sure that they can't affect the commodities markets by dumping platinum and palladium into these markets. I think that that's incredibly important to, continue to be very serious about these sanctions until we get the desired result out of Russia. And, if there's a slight tempering of that during a negotiation to get somebody to the table, I'm not particularly happy, but I understand why to get this done. And hopefully we can bring this to a conclusion, because one of our best tools right there is financial, and making sure that we do have meaningful sanctions to basically get the behavior that we want out of them.
I want to hear more about platinum and palladium in your state of Montana. This is really important stuff, and I suspect that you're talking to the administration about this. Is the federal government or the Trump administration specifically stepping up to help you protect those resources and, more importantly, harvest and process them?
Harvest and process. I like that. That second part that you said, processing, is obviously a big issue with all of our critical minerals, our metals, everything that we're doing. Is we can pull a lot of stuff out of the ground that we don't have the capacity to actually turn into a usable material. So that's a big part of this equation, because we talk about being dependent on other nations, especially adversarial nations, on critical minerals, on all these things. But even the ones that we're pulling out of the ground, very often we have to send them abroad to have them processed. So I think that is something that we should be looking at in repatriating a lot of that processing. But I'll tell you, the critical minerals has obviously been a big part of the Trump administration's goals, making sure we're doing that right. And it comes down to a couple of things. For my district, it's obviously a big economic issue, because it's jobs in Stillwater County and Yellowstone County. It's meaningful there. To not be able to continue pulling platinum and palladium out of the ground. But it's also national security issues. We can't be dependent on somebody else, anybody else in raw base material. And that's across the spectrum, from rare earths to critical minerals to copper, everything that we need to continue building the future. We need to be able to source it, if not directly from America, then to close allies. And I think that's incredibly important, that we continue finding ways to solve those problems.
I'm really glad that we can talk about it, because it's the linchpin to a deal with China when we consider the importance of rare earth minerals and magnets that we're trying to get access to in this country. And I know that a trade deal with China could take some time. It's been rather elusive, and it's, of course, the biggest economy after ours. So it's been basically put into a different category. But, Congressman, I wonder your thoughts on the tariff program as it stands now. We saw reciprocals go into place last week, and there have been a lot of questions about the impact on prices, whether it's a one-time shift or an inflationary trend. How do Montanans feel about this?
There has
how
been,
do your farmers feel about it?
Yeah, there's been so much fear-mongering in this space. And the truth of it is that it's working. I mean, you look at the CPI numbers that came out, almost completely unfazed by tariff issues. I think it was 3.7 down to 2.4, positive movement there, completely unfazed. You look at the money coming in from the tariffs and what that can do in bridging the gap in our national, everybody's talking about, adding to the deficit, adding to the debt. You see that money coming in and bridging that gap. And I think the last part that we need to start looking at is, you started this program talking about the Fed, and one of the biggest issues in growing that gap is debt service. And so really looking at interest rates. If we can start pulling that back, I think we can bridge that gap and start to see some positive numbers there. But one thing I want to point out is a lot of the policies that have come in this administration, going to tariff issues, going to the One Big Beautiful Bill, a lot of this stuff has, set the foundation for really charging the economy, but hasn't really gotten up to speed yet. Those tax cuts, I always say that the biggest driver to economic prosperity is access to capital. The best capital you can access is your own. If you're paying less in taxes, you start having more money in your pocket to start putting into the economy. That's the driver that bridges this gap.
Looks like that's what Wall Street's betting on right now, Congressman. We appreciate the conversation as always. Troy Downing, Montana's 2nd District. Pretty cool to think about being in Yellowstone County. Thanks, Congressman. I'm Joe Mathieu. I'll meet you back here on the late edition of Balance of Power. That's 5 p.m. Eastern Time here on Bloomberg.